I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sludders. We're going to get started this morning with a verdict in the trial over the shooting on the Rust movie set. A New Mexico jury found weapons supervisor Hannah Gutierrez-Reed guilty for her role in the fatal shooting of cinematographer Halyna Hutchins.
This was the moment that the jury read its verdict to Gutierrez after deliberating for just under 3 hours. The trial, which centered on the 2021 shooting, lasted nearly 2 weeks. Gutierrez was found guilty of 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter. The jury returned a not guilty verdict on 1 count of evidence tampering. She now faces up to 3 years in prison. Her lawyers say they are going to appeal the verdict. In closing arguments yesterday, the prosecution said Gutierrez-Reed acted irresponsibly while on the set of Rust.
This is an involuntary manslaughter charge because she didn't know there were live rounds on set, and the reason she didn't know was through her own negligence, her own recklessness.
NBC News legal analyst Danny Ceballos joins us now to break it all down. So it took the jury just 2.5 hours to reach this verdict. Guilty involuntary manslaughter, not guilty evidence tampering. Are you surprised at all, or is this what you expected?
I'm not surprised as to the tampering. The only evidence there was that somebody saw a white bag of powder. It was never tested. So not a surprise on the acquittal there. I suppose I am a little surprised that this was a guilty verdict. But if there was a case to be made, the strongest case was always against the armorer. Their defense mission was to point fingers at absolutely everyone else. But the state's case actually ended up being stronger than I expected. They had a lot of photographic evidence. They had a lot of testimonial evidence. They had a lot of statements from the defendant and others, which, by the way, if I can do a PSA, again, this entire case was built against this armor, mostly on statements she gave that were either on body cam video to the police or when she literally came in and sat down for interviews that all came back to haunt her in this case against her. So there's my PSA. You don't cooperate in police's investigation if you're going to be the one they're going to use it against. But the bottom line is the case was made against the armorer here. If there was one to be made, she did have the responsibility, even if other people shared that responsibility. She was the armorer, so not a huge surprise that if there is a guilty verdict, it will be against her. I still think Alec Baldwin gets acquitted.
Tell us more about how the prosecution laid out their case and what we did hear from them in their closing arguments.
You know, you just saw a great clip. I mean, a great example that the prosecution used was that, look, we're not saying Hannah Gutierrez-Reed intentionally put these live rounds on set. That's what negligence is. Through her negligence, they introduced photographs of guns being used negligently on the set to create an atmosphere that she was generally negligent while on set. They did a good job of introducing that evidence. Where I think they didn't do a great job is they promised at the outset, we'll show you where these live rounds came from. But ultimately, the sum of that evidence was, hey, who else could they have come from but the armorer Hannah Gutierrez-Reed? But whatever the case may be, they did make, I thought, a good point that the difference between dummy rounds, blanks, and live rounds are something that an armorer should have known if she was careful and was checking. But due to the negligence on the set, the live round ended up tragically in a firearm that was capable of shooting it.
Let's talk about the defense and first show just a moment from the closing argument from the defense yesterday.
She could not anticipate what Baldwin would do. It was not in the script. It was not foreseeable. Management was responsible for safety failures and not Hannah. There's zero evidence of cocaine. There's no testing. And again, I go back to the idea that Hannah is a scapegoat for all the management failures. They do hope she gets convicted, so they're all exonerated. They can move forward.
The jury didn't buy that argument. Was it a strong argument to make?
Can I make my second PSA?
Yes.
And it is this. If you watch this and you watch the Fulton County hearings in Georgia last week, you saw people commit the cardinal sin, which is the PowerPoint during closing with lots of words on it. And what you saw there was him reading from that PowerPoint. You're asking a jury to read while you read along and read. Should I read? Should I listen? Should I listen to you reading? I think this is just a cardinal sin. You should not do it. Look at that cadence there. You saw it in that clip. Not very dynamic. You end up just reading a book from a pulpit. Not exciting. So that's my second and final PSA. But The defense's arguments there were really just that other people did this. This was other people's responsibility. And really, ultimately, I thought in the end, the state had the stronger case showing that even if other people were responsible, they conceded that. That's a very effective tool in your closing argument for the state. They say the defense is going to come up here and say it was a bunch of other people's responsibility and that the armorer was overwhelmed. And those are all good points. But at the end of the day, the armorer, literally her name means that she is involved and has primary responsibility for the safety of the firearms. And these firearms were not safe, obviously.
Speaking of other people, this all raises the question. Alec Baldwin, he's now charged with involuntary manslaughter. Has pleaded not guilty, has said that he did not pull the trigger. What is the differences? What are the differences in these two cases?
First, a guilty verdict here was good for Alec Baldwin. An acquittal would have been good for Alec Baldwin because it would have shown the state's case is weak against their strongest subject. But either way, Alec Baldwin's team has now gotten a first look at the evidence of the state. So all around a plus for Alec Baldwin. Now, Alec Baldwin's case is a lot different. He didn't have primary responsibility like the armor, and also key is going to be the operability, how the firearm works. The best evidence against Alec Baldwin is his stupid statements that he gave. Number one, that he would never point a gun at anyone, and number two, that he didn't pull the trigger. Those two were dumb things to say. They will be evidence against him.
All right, Danny. Appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much.
Well, tonight on Capitol Hill, President Biden will deliver his high-stakes State of the Union address as a rematch takes shape against presumptive GOP nominee Donald Trump.
With his approval numbers still lagging, the president hopes to win over doubters and give his re-election campaign a shot in the arm. His goal, highlight accomplishments over the past 3+ years and lay out the choice facing voters in November. For more on what we can expect tonight, we're joined by NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba and NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles. Good morning to both of you.
Yeah, Monica, let's get started with you. So this is actually the latest in the year that a State of the Union address has ever been delivered. What should we know about what we can expect tonight?
Exactly, Savannah. As you said it, the stakes are high, the speech is very long, and some of the moments that might be the key takeaways are some of those unpredictable ones, things that even the White House can't plan for, but maybe is discussing how to handle if they do take place. And those are just some of the spontaneous moments, reactions in the chamber. But in terms of the content of the speech and the substance, this is really President Biden's opportunity, the White House says, to try to put everything he feels he's accomplished in the last couple of years in one bucket and try to frame why he wants to do that in another 4 years for his reelection in a separate bucket, and try to marry those two themes and discuss that in this larger context domestically and internationally. Here's a little bit more of what we can expect from that kind of a message from the White House press secretary yesterday.
You will hear the president lay out the historic achievements he has delivered on for the American people and his vision for the future. The president will outline an agenda that is about continuing to build on the progress that we've made over the last 3 years. The president has always been an optimistic person, as you all know, and even in the face of challenges that we have in front of us, he will share why he is hopeful about this country's future.
So a major theme you're going to see here is the president talking about trying to lower costs for Americans, even though they may not be feeling all of the effects of that. And then also just talking about his economic plans, while, of course, trying to nod to some of the issues of the other side of Republicans that he is going to be discussing without mentioning necessarily the name of his general election opponent now that that is set, of course, former President Trump.
So, Ryan, let's bring you in here. The president's going to deliver this speech before a divided Congress, like really divided. This is going to be Republican Speaker Mike Johnson's first State of the Union since winning the speakership. He'll be right behind the president in view of the cameras the entire time. What's he been saying about this?
Well, Speaker Johnson has been very clear that he believes that there's a very different vision for America between Republicans and Democrats. And we'll probably see that on display in the chamber where maybe only half of the audience is standing and applauding at certain points during the president's speech. But Johnson did a bit of a pre-buttal yesterday where he laid out the big differences he sees between the Republican vision and the Biden administration vision. Take a listen to how he responded.
If you had to describe in one word what you believe the State of the Union is, you've heard the word crisis, you've heard catastrophe. I think maybe a summary is decline. And I say that with great sadness, we all do. But it's because of this president and his administration that we are indisputably in decline.
And so Republicans really painting a different picture of what the State of the Union is. And what President Biden's going to hope to do, as Monica laid out, is demonstrate the accomplishments that his administration has been able to get over the finish line over these past 3 years, while Republicans are going to argue that much of it hasn't worked. And that's one of the reasons that they believe this will be President Biden's final State of the Union. Joe.
Monica, immigration and the ongoing situation at the southern border is expected to be a big focal point for the president. What do we think we'll hear on that point tonight?
I think you're going to hear the president repeat some of the things he said when he visited the border recently, which is to really take Republicans to task. He's going to argue for torpedoing the bipartisan deal that was on the table that really would have been some of the toughest reforms to the current immigration system, which the president, by the way, says is broken, and which really would have provided some essential funding for personnel and additional border security. So I think the president is going to say something like, we put this on the table. We had members of both parties working on it for months. There were negotiations. And then at the end of the day, Republicans did not decide to back it because of some comments he may link to or allude to from the former president. So I think he is going to be clear about that, even though we are reporting that he's not expected to announce any kind of executive action when it comes to immigration, even though that is something the administration has been considering. And it's possible they could do that at a later date, because I'm told by sources that they agree that they can't do nothing when it comes to the border. There's something that's going to have to happen if they can't get Congress to act, which it does seem is not going to be the likely path.
Ryan, of course, after the speech, we're going to hear the Republican response that's delivered by Alabama Senator Katie Britt. That's a name that a lot of our viewers may not know terribly well. What should we know about her? What can we expect there?
Well, Joe, she's certainly a rising star in the Republican Party, a 42-year-old mother, one of the youngest members of the United States Senate. And she's someone who is articulate and someone who Republicans really believe can share what they believe is the difference between the Republican agenda and the Democratic agenda. Of course, the response to the State of the Union is often a sought-after spot, but it's also an enormous challenge. It is very difficult to replicate the pomp and circumstance of what happens inside the chamber with a speech that's usually delivered in a very quiet room, directly to camera, without applause lines and without the energy that you see inside the chamber. But many believe that Britt is up to the task. She is someone who Republicans believe have a very bright future. She hasn't spent a lot of time in the media spotlight. She's worked a lot behind the scenes. This is her moment to introduce herself to the American public.
Monica, this is really sort of essentially the Biden launch of a general election campaign now that we have the presumptive nominee in former President Trump. While exactly what he says might not necessarily be remembered by a lot of voters, a lot of people at home, how he says it, his performance, his demeanor might be, especially as questions about his age linger. How much of a concern and focus is that tonight?
Well, the White House would say that you're going to see a very energized president tonight who is going to really put some of those concerns to rest. That is how they frame it, because, of course, this is a speech that is a teleprompter speech. He's been practicing it for several days. We know for years the president has talked about this. He struggles with a stutter, and sometimes he does have those issues with his delivery. But because they've been able to put all the prep into this, they don't really think that that's going to be an aspect of it. But the way that they're going to continue to counter those larger concerns, which we do see reflected in polls, is to go send the president on the road and to travel. He's going to be in Philadelphia tomorrow. He's going to be in Atlanta on Saturday. And I'm told that after the State of the Union, there's going to be kind of a massive travel blitz where you're going to be seeing the president out there and engaging with voters in a more personal way than we've seen in recent weeks. Savannah and Joe.
All right, Monica and Ryan, thank you both very much.
For more on the State of the Union, we're joined now by David Litt. He's a former speechwriter for President Obama and a best-selling author. Good to have you with us. No one better to help us understand what to expect tonight. So State of the Unions, the stakes are always high, especially in election year, especially when President Biden looks at the polls and wants to be doing better. What do you expect to see tonight?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me this morning. And I think that tonight, as a speechwriter, I always thought, especially because I was, a team of one of 8. And the State of the Union, it's a big night. But it's also more than just one night, because for us in the speechwriting office for President Obama, we would be looking at the State of the Union almost as a guide for the next 3 to 6 months. If there was a speech coming up, we would say, what did the SOTU say about that? Right? That was a way for us and people throughout the government to think about the story the president wanted to tell about the country, about the moment, and as you pointed out, in this year, about the upcoming election.
Walk us through what's kind of going on right now, maybe what's going on the past few days. You're part of a speechwriting team. You're part of Obama's. How do you interact with the president about this? How is he preparing, and then what it all culminates in tonight?
Well, every president is different, but I think one of the things that you've heard from President Biden's team is that the president is really involved in his own State of the Union, right? He has a speechwriter, they're working together, but really this comes down to the president usually talking with that person and going back and forth and trying to figure out, how do I want to talk about this? What is the vision? What's on my mind? Because it's very, very rare these days that we know that millions and millions of Americans are going to be watching a speech. Usually at this point, we're watching clips of something, maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. So the idea, I mean, I think last year 27 million Americans watched the State of the Union address. That big an audience is really hard to get, even for a president these days.
You are a writer, so clearly the words are incredibly important, but we can't ignore the fact of what the polls tell us, which are people are worried about his age. How important is the performance going to be here tonight?
Well, I think performance is always important, but I also think that part of the White House's job and part of what you'll see from the Biden team is that we need to get past pure theater criticism, right? This election ultimately is not about Joe Biden or Donald Trump. In any election, it's about us. What are our next 4 years going to look like? And I think part of what you're going to see President Biden do tonight is lay out a vision for our next 4 years, not his next 4 years. He's going to be fine, right? Joe Biden's a very successful guy. The question is, what are the rest of us going to experience? And the other thing I will say about this is I would look for some of those unscripted moments. I don't know if you remember this, but last year there was a lot of heckling from members of Congress. I don't know when this became normal, but somehow it did. And so I think we're going to see some of those moments. That's, frankly, I think where Biden was at his best last year. The speech itself was good, but he also, you know, he could dish it right back. And I think those are some of those things that, you know, maybe, to put it charitably, some of his Republican friends might pretend he's not capable of. I think he'll be demonstrating that.
Is that part of the prep, how to handle the heckling?
I don't think so. I think, you know, Joe Biden's been doing this for a long time, but I think that ability to show poise and you know, that unscripted moment can be just as powerful as the things that the speechwriters have been working on for months.
All right. David Litt, thanks so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to be previewing tonight's State of the Union address throughout the day here on NBC News Now. And our extensive live coverage of the address gets underway tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 o'clock Pacific.
Well, Alabama's Republican governor has signed a new bill into law protecting IVF clinics. The bill protects providers and patients from lawsuits if embryos are destroyed. It comes in the wake of that controversial ruling from the state's Supreme Court last month that frozen embryos are people under law.
The new bill will allow clinics to restart treatments that have been on hold. It passed with bipartisan support, and Governor Kay Ivey signed it just moments after it hit her desk. Critics say the law doesn't go far enough, but at least 2 fertility clinics in the state are prepared to resume treatments as soon as this week.
Well, in Cairo this morning, ceasefire talks aimed at halting the war in Gaza and releasing both Israeli hostages as well as Palestinian prisoners have stalled without a breakthrough.
Reports say representatives of Hamas have left Cairo, but that talks would continue to try and reach a deal by the start of Ramadan on Sunday. International pressure is mounting on Israel to allow more aid into Gaza. The UN's humanitarian coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory says they're looking at a new route to get aid to Gaza's starving population.
Hunger has reached catastrophic levels, and especially in the north of Gaza, which we haven't served for weeks. We need to significantly scale up the humanitarian assistance in there. And that would be that, you know, we have to use this military road, this fence road at the side, on the eastern side, to allow material to come from the crossing point at Kerem Shalom and Rafah all the way up to the north and into the north.
NBC News International correspondent Raf Sanchez joins us from Tel Aviv. Raf, good morning. So let's start with the ceasefire talks. Is there any chance that a deal is likely by the weekend?
Savannah, it's looking very, very unlikely. As you mentioned, the talks in Cairo have broken up now without a breakthrough. It is not clear when we are next going to see negotiators getting back to the table. And these talks broke up with it sounding like both sides were pretty much at zero-sum positions. You'll remember Israel, the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar went to Paris. They hammered out a framework. That framework was presented to Hamas, and the hope was that they might say yes to it. Instead, Hamas came back with a counter-proposal with a lot of their original positions, including a demand to end the war entirely, something Israel says it won't do until Hamas is destroyed, and to withdraw all Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, something Israel says it is not willing to do. So for those Palestinian civilians in northern Gaza, desperately short of food, for the hostages still being held, no sign of a breakthrough at this point. Guys.
Yeah, Raph, I mean, many UN and relief agencies say Israel is blocking aid from getting into Gaza, where starvation is just becoming a huge concern. Talk to us about this growing pressure on Israel to let more aid in and how Israel is responding to all this.
So the pressure on Israel is to both get more aid into Gaza, but also to make sure the conditions exist inside the Strip so that aid can be distributed. You heard from that UN representative earlier, the big problem is northern Gaza, where, according to humanitarian groups, both Israeli military restrictions and a complete collapse of law and order are making it very difficult to get that aid out. I asked an Israeli government spokesman about Israel's responsibility to make sure that aid can be distributed. Take a listen to a little of that conversation. Do you accept Israel is failing in that responsibility?
I can't address the issue of law and order because that's not a question for COGAT, but I can tell you that in terms of securing the convoys themselves, that is something that the international organizations are responsible for. They are responsible for
How can they be
securing...
responsible? They don't have weapons.
There are ways to secure these convoys in the same way that international organizations do so in many different places throughout the world where they have to deliver humanitarian aid. It is their responsibility to do so in this situation as well.
Now, you have heard administration officials saying again and again Israel needs to do more to get aid into northern Gaza, and it's likely to be a message the president repeats tonight at the State of the Union. Guys.
Raf, Israel also is facing global condemnation after it approved 3,500 new settlements in the occupied West Bank. That is considered illegal under international law. Tell us more about this, explain this to us, and tell us also what we're hearing from the United States. What's reaction on this?
So from the State Department, Savannah, we're hearing relatively standard language. They are criticizing this decision, saying the settlements are a barrier to a two-state solution. They're saying this is contrary to international law. But what we consistently see is the settlements in the occupied West Bank get bigger and bigger. And the Biden administration so far deciding not to take any actual measures to punish, sanction the Israeli government for these settlement expansions. We have seen the administration put sanctions on individual settlers in the West Bank accused of committing acts of violence against Palestinian civilians, but no action against the settlements themselves. There had been something of a pause on the growth of settlements, but this right-wing government under Benjamin Netanyahu determined, it seems, to keep expanding them. Guys.
All right, Raf, thank you so much.
Time for a check on your morning news now weather.
Angie Lastman is in studio with us. Angie, good morning.
Good morning, guys. Yesterday, it was all about the rain across the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, parts of the, really, let's just say a whole third of the eastern part of our country. Instead, today, we're going to see a general drying trend. We do still have a couple of spots that are picking up some additional rain, but this system's on the way out. Places like New York, Washington, D.C., stretching down into the Carolinas, we're going to see drier conditions from here through the rest of your day. Those northern portions of New England, that's where we're still dealing with a little bit more of this rain that will start to wrap up here even as we get closer to lunchtime. But because of this additional rain, still dealing with a couple of flood watches that are in effect for parts of New Hampshire and Maine. That's it. All the others have since expired. Now, as we get rid of that system, we've got the next one that we're going to, of course, watch work through the middle of the country. Today, we're going to pick up some additional snow across parts of the Rockies. We've got some rain to deal with and some strong storms that we'll have to track here as we get into the later parts of today and even after dark tonight. We'll show you that here in a moment. As we look ahead to tomorrow, we really start to see this system ramping up across the Great Lakes, the Midwest. We've got some heavy rain that we're going to expect. We've got some strong storms across parts of the South as well. And this system isn't done as we get through your Friday. By Saturday, it works a little farther to the east, and we've got soggy conditions on tap and the potential of a couple more strong storms across parts of the South. So let's start with today. This afternoon and into this evening, we've got 6 million people under this risk of seeing some of these strong to severe storms. What do we have as far as impacts. Hail is going to be the thing we watch for to have the greatest chance of occurring, about an inch or larger as possible. We'll also see the potential for some of those stronger wind gusts, and we can't rule out a tornado or two. By tomorrow, a much larger area at risk for some of these stronger storms. Again, afternoon and evening after dark, we could be talking about nocturnal tornadoes. We know how much more dangerous those are once it gets dark. 20 million people at risk of this, including major cities, Dallas, Jackson, Mobile, New Orleans, all included in that for tomorrow. Same impacts will remain. And we, of course, have some heavy rain that we're going to track, too. Localized amounts 4 to 8 inches. I think widespread rain 1 inch to 2 inches. But we know that the flooding concern will be there across this region here as we get through Friday, guys. Never a dull moment in the weather department.
No, lots of rain this week, too.
Yeah,
all
large
right.
hail. Angie, thank you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.